Chapter 5 of The Men in the Walls by William Tenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Far off in the dazzling distance, he caught sight of the tremendously long gray body he had heard about since childhood, higher than 100 men standing on each other's shoulders. The thick gray legs, each wider than two hefty men standing chest to chest. He caught just one wide-eyed, fear-soluble glimpse of the thing before he went into complete panic. His panic was redeemed by a single inhibition. He didn't spring forward and run away from the wall. But that was only because it would have meant running directly toward the monster. For one thoroughly insane moment, however, he thought of trying to claw his way through the wall against which his shoulders were pressed. Then, because it was the direction he had been running in, he remembered the doorway. He must be about 35 paces from it. There lay safety, his uncle, the band, mankind, and the burrows. The blessed closed-in narrow burrows. Eric leaped along the wall for the doorway. He ran as he'd never in his life run before, as he'd never imagined he could run. But even as he fled madly, almost weeping at the effort he was making, a few sane thoughts, the results of long, tiresome drills as an initiate, organized themselves in his screaming mind. He had been closer to the structure in which the strangers were hiding, the structure which Arthur the Organizer explained was a piece of monster furniture. He should have turned the other way, toward the structure, gotten between it and the wall. There, unless he'd been seen as the monster entered the larder, he could have rested safely until it was possible to make his escape. He had gone too far to turn back now. But run silently, he reminded himself. Run swiftly, but make no noise. Make no noise at all. According to the lessons that the warriors taught, at this distance, monster hearing was more to be feared than monster vision. Run silently. Run for your life. He reached the door. It had been set back in place. In disbelief and utter horror, he stared at the curved line in the wall that showed where the door had been replaced in its socket. But this was never done. This had never been heard of. Eric beat frantically on the door with his fists. Would his knuckles make enough noise to penetrate the heavy slab? Or just enough to attract the monster's attention? He twisted his head quickly. A deliberately wasted moment to estimate the closeness of his danger. The monster's legs moved so slowly, its speed would have been laughable if the very size of those legs didn't serve to push it forward an incredible distance with each step. And there was nothing laughable in that long, narrow neck, almost as long as the rest of the body, and the malevolent, relatively tiny head on the end of the neck, and those horrible pink things all around the neck, just behind the head. It was much nearer than it had been just seconds ago, but whether it had noticed him and was coming at him, he had no idea. Beat at the door with the shaft of a spear? That should attract attention. That might be heard. Yes, by the monsters, too. There was only one thing to do. He stepped a few paces back from the wall. Then he leaped forward, smashing his shoulder into the door. He felt it give a little. Another try. The floor-shaking thumps of the monster's steps were now so close as to be almost deafening. At any moment, a great gray foot might come down and grind out his life. Eric stepped back, forcing himself not to look up. Another leap, another bruising collision with the door. It had definitely moved. An indentation showed all around it. Was he about to be stepped on? To be squashed? Eric put his hands on the door. He pushed. Slowly, suckingly, it left the place out of which it had been carved long ago. Where was the monster? How close? How close? Suddenly the door fell over into the burrow, and Eric spilled painfully on top of it. He scrambled to his feet and darted down the corridor. He had no time to feel relief. His mind was repeating its lessons, reminding him what he had to do next in such a situation. Run a short distance down the burrow, then stop and wait on the balls of your feet, ready to bolt. Get as much air into your lungs as possible. You may need it. If you hear a hissing, whistling sound, stop breathing and start running. Hold your breath for as long as you can, as long as you possibly can. Then suck another chestful of air and keep running. Keep this up until you are far away. Far, far away. Eric waited, poised to run, his back to the doorway. Don't look around. Just face the direction you have to run. There's only one thing you have to worry about. Only one thing you have to listen for. A hissing, whistling sound. When you hear it, hold your breath and run. He waited, his muscles contracted for instant action. Time went by. He remembered to count. If you counted up to 500, slowly, and nothing happened, you were likely to be all right. You could assume the monster probably hadn't noticed you. So the experienced warriors said, the men who had lived through such an experience. 500. He reached 500 and, just to be on the safe side, still tense, still ready to run, counted another 500, up to the ultimate number conceived by man, a full 1,000. No hissing, no whistling sounds, no suggestion of danger. He relaxed, and his muscles, suddenly set free, gave way. He fell to the floor of the burrow, whimpering with the release of tension. It was over. His theft was over. He was a man. He had been in the same place as a monster, and lived through it. He had met strangers and dealt with them as a representative of mankind. Such things as he would have to tell his uncle. His uncle. Where was his uncle? Where was the band? Suddenly, fully aware of how much was wrong, Eric scrambled to his feet and walked cautiously back to the open doorway. The burrow was empty. They hadn't waited for him. But that was another incredible thing. A band never gave an initiate up for lost until at least 2 full days had gone by. In the chief's absence, of course, this was measured by the sleep periods of the band captain. Any band would wait 2 days before giving up and turning homeward, and Eric was positive his uncle would have waited a bit longer than that for him. He'd been away for such a short time. Then what had happened? He crept to the doorway and peeped outside. There was almost no dizziness this time. His eyes adjusted quickly to the different scale of distance. The monster was busy on the other side of the larder. It had merely been crossing the room then, not pursuing and attacking. Apparently it hadn't noticed him at all. Fantastic! And with all the noise he had made, all the rushing back and forth, that battering down of the door. The monster turned abruptly, walked a few gigantic steps, and hurled itself at the structure in which Eric had met the strangers. The walls, the floor, everything shook mightily in sympathy with the impact of the great organism as it wriggled a bit and became still. Eric was startled until he realized that the creature had done no more than lie down in the structure. It was a piece of monster furniture after all. How had that felt to Arthur the Organizer and Walter the Weapon Seeker and the others hidden in the base? Eric grinned. Those strangers must be a little less haughty, a little more sober at this moment. Meanwhile, he had work to do, things to find out. He got his fingers under the slab of door and tugged it upright. It was heavy. He pushed against it slowly, carefully, first one side and then the other, walking it back to the hole in the wall. A final push and it slid into place tightly, only the thin, curved line suggesting its existence. Now he could look around. There had been a fight here, that much was certain. A bitter, brief battle. Examining the area closely, Eric saw unmistakable signs of conflict. A broken spear shaft, some blood on the wall, part of a torn knapsack. No bodies, of course. You were not likely to find bodies after a battle. Any people of the burrows knew that the one unavoidable imperative of victory was to drag the bodies away and dispose of them. No one might ever leave dead enemies to rot where they would foul the corridors. So there had been a battle. He had been right. His uncle and his uncle's band had not just gone off and left him. There must have been an attack by a superior force. The band had stood its ground for a while, sustained some losses, and then been forced to retreat. But there were a few things which didn't make sense. First, it was very unusual for a war party of strangers to come this close to monster territory. The burrows which were inhabited by mankind, the natural goal of a war party, were much further back. At this point, you would not expect to find any group larger than a foraging expedition, a stranger band at most. His uncle's men, fully armed, operating under battle alert, could easily cope with a single band of weavers, weaponsmiths, or traders from the decadent back burrows. They would have driven them off, possibly taking a few prisoners, and continued to wait for him. That left only two possibilities. The unlikely war party, a 2 or 3 band attack, and even more unlikely, a band from another fierce front burrow people. But front burrowers rarely went prowling at random near monster territory. They would have had their own door cut into it and would tend to feel hugely uncertain about one belonging to another people. They too would head for the inhabited burrows if they were on any business other than the important one of stealing for their tribe's needs. And another thing, unless his uncle's band had been wiped out to the very last man, a thought Eric rejected as highly improbable, the survivors were honor-bound by their oath of manhood after doing whatever the immediate military situation required, from pursuit to retreat, to return as soon as possible to the spot where an initiate was expected back from his theft. No warrior would dare face the women if he failed to do this. Possibly the attack had just come. Possibly his uncle's band was a short distance away, still fighting their way from burrow's end to burrow's end, and once they had gotten clear of the enemy, would make their way back to him. No, in that case he should be able to hear the battle still going on, and the burrows were dreadfully still. Eric shivered. A warrior was not meant to be abroad without companions. He'd heard of tribeless strangers. Once, as a child, he remembered enjoying the intricate execution of a man who'd been expelled from his own people for some major crime, and who had wandered pathetically into the neighborhood of mankind. But these people were hardly to be considered human. Tribes, bands, societies were the surroundings of human creatures. It was awful to be alone. It was unthinkable. Without bothering to eat, though he was quite hungry after his theft, he began walking rapidly down the corridor. After a while, he broke into a trot. He wanted to get home as soon as possible, to be among his own kind again. He reached into his back sling and got a spear for each hand. A nervous business going through the corridors all by yourself. They were so empty and so quiet. They hadn't seemed this quiet when he'd been on expedition with the band, and so fearfully, frighteningly dim. Eric had never before realized how much difference there was between the light you got from one forehead glow lamp and the usual band complement of a half dozen. He found himself getting more and more wary of the unexpected shadows where the wall curved sharply. He picked up speed as he ran past the black hole of a branching burrow. At any one of those places an enemy could be waiting for him, warned by the sound of his approaching footsteps. It would be the same enemy which had attacked his uncle's band, a handful of cruel and murderous strangers, or a horde of them. It could be something worse. Abruptly, he remembered legends of unmentionable creatures who lurked in the empty burrows, creatures who fled before the approach of a band of warriors, but who would come noiselessly upon a single man. Big creatures who engulfed you, tiny creatures who came in their hundreds and nibbled you to pieces. Eric kept jerking his head around to look behind him. At least he could keep his doom from taking him by surprise. It was awful to be alone. And yet, in the midst of his fears, his mind returned again and again to the problem of his uncle's disappearance. Eric could not believe anything serious had happened to him. Thomas the Trap Smasher was a veteran of too many bloody adventures, too many battles against unequal odds. Then where had he gone? And where had he taken the band? And why was there no sound of him anywhere? No sign in all this infinity of gloomy, stretching, menace-filled tunnels. Fortunately, he was an eye. He knew the way back, and sped desperately along it without the slightest feeling of doubt. The record machine was right. He would never be lost. Let him just get safely back to the companionship of mankind, and he would be Eric the Eye. And there it was again. Who had been right? The record machine or his uncle? The vision that named him had come from the record machine, but his uncle claimed that this was religious claptrap. The vision had been selected and his name proposed to the women well in advance of the ceremony. And his uncle was an alien sciencer, in touch with strangers who were also alien sciencers. So many things had happened in the last 2 days, Eric felt. So much of his world had shifted. It was as if the walls of the burrows had moved outward and upward until they resembled monster territory more than human areas. He was getting close now. These corridors looked friendlier, more familiar. He made himself run faster, although he was almost at the point of exhaustion. He wanted to be home, to be officially Eric the Eye, to inform mankind of what had happened, so that a rescue and searching party could be sent out for his uncle. That doorway to monster territory, who had replaced it? If a battle had been fought and his uncle's band had retreated, still fighting, would the attacker have stopped to put the door neatly back in its socket? No. Could it be explained by a sudden onslaught and the complete extermination of his uncle's band? Then, before dragging the bodies away, the enemy would have had time to put the door back. A doorway into monster territory was a valuable human resource, after all. Valuable to mankind and strangers alike. Why jeopardize it by leaving it visible and open? But who or what could have been capable of such a sudden onslaught, such a complete extermination of the best-led band in all mankind? He'd have to get the answer from one of the other band captains, or possibly a wise old crone in the female society. Definitely within the boundaries of mankind now, Eric forced himself to slow to a walk. He would be coming upon a sentry at any moment, and he had no desire at all to have a spear flung through him. A sentry would react violently to a man dashing out of the darkness. "Eric the Only," he called out, identifying himself with each step. "This is Eric the Only." Then he remembered his theft proudly and changed the identification. Eric the Eye. This is Eric the Eye, the Aspire, the further seeing, less paying eye. Eric the Eye is coming back to mankind. Oddly, there was no returning call of recognition. Eric didn't understand that. Had mankind itself been attacked and driven away from its burrow? A sentry should respond to a familiar name. Something was very inexplicably wrong. Then he came around the last curve and saw the sentry at the other end. Rather, he saw what at first looked like three sentries. They were staring at him, and he recognized them. Stephen the Strong-Armed and two members of Stephen's band. Evidently he had arrived just at the moment when the sentry on duty was about to be relieved. That would account for Stephen and the other man. But why hadn't they replied to his shouts of identification? They stood there silently as he came up, their spears still at the ready, not going down in welcome. "Eric the Eye," he repeated, puzzled. "I've made my theft, but something happened to the rest." His voice trailed off as Stephen came up to him, his face grim, his powerful muscles taut. The band captain shoved a spear point hard into Eric's chest. "Don't move," he warned. "Barney, John, tie him up. We've caught the little rat." End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Men in the Walls by William Tenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. His spears taken from him, his arms bound securely behind his back by the thongs of his own knapsack, Eric was pushed and prodded into the great central burrow of mankind. The place was almost unrecognizable. Under the direction of Ottilie, the chieftain's first wife, a horde of women, what seemed at first like the entire membership of the female society, was setting up a platform in front of the royal mound. With the great scarcity of any building materials that mankind suffered from, a construction of this sort was startling and unusual, yet there was something about it that awoke highly unpleasant memories in Eric's mind. But he was pulled from place to place too fast, and there were too many other unprecedented things going on for him to be able to identify the memory properly. Two women, who were accredited members of the female society, were not working under Ottilie's direction, he noticed. Bound hand and foot, they were lying against the far wall of the great central burrow. They were both covered with blood and showed every sign of having undergone prolonged and most vicious torture. He judged them to be barely this side of death. As he was jerked past, he recognized them. They were the two wives of Thomas the Trap Smasher. Just wait until his uncle got back. Someone would really pay for this, he thought, more in absolute amazement than horror. He had the feeling that he must keep the horror away at all costs. Once let it in, and it would soak through his thoughts right into the memory he was trying to avoid. The place was full of armed men, running back and forth from their band captains to unknown destinations in the outlying corridors. Between them and around them scuttled the children, fetching and carrying raw materials for the hard-working women. There was a steady buzz of commands in the air. "Go to! Bring me some! Hurry with the—" that mingled with the smell of many people whose pores were sweating urgently. And it wasn't just sweat that he smelled. Eric realized as he was dragged before the royal mound. It was anger. The anger and fear of all mankind. Franklin, the father of many thieves, stood on the mound, carrying unaccustomed spears in his fat hands, talking rapidly to a group of warriors, band captains, and, yes, actually, strangers. Even now, Eric found he could still be astonished at this fantastic development. Strangers in the very midst of mankind, walking around freely and bearing arms. As the chief caught sight of Eric, his face broke into a loose-skinned smile. He nudged a stranger beside him and pointed at the prisoner. "That's him," he said. "That's the nephew. The one that asked for the third category theft. Now we've got them all." The stranger didn't smile. He looked briefly at Eric and turned away. "I'm glad you think so. From our point of view, you've just got one more." Franklin's smile faded to an uncertain grin. "Well, you know what I mean. And the damn fool came back by himself. It saved us a lot of trouble. Didn't it?" Receiving no answer, he shrugged. He gestured with flabby imperiousness at Eric's guards. "You know where to put him. We'll be ready for them pretty soon." Again, the point of a spear stabbed into Eric's back, and he was forced forward across the central space to a small burrow entrance. Before he could reach it, however, he heard Franklin, the father of many thieves, call out to mankind, "There goes Eric, my people. Eric the only. Now we've got the last of the filthy gang." For a moment the activity stopped and seemed to focus on him. Eric shivered as a low, drawn-out grunt of viciousness and hatred arose everywhere, but most of all from the women. Someone ran up to him, Harriet the history-teller. The girl's face was absolutely contorted. She reached up to the crown of her head and pulled out the long pin held in place by a few knotted scarlet hairs. About her face and neck the hair danced like flames. "You alien sciencer!" she shrieked, driving the pin straight at his eyes. "You filthy, filthy alien sciencer!" Eric whipped his head to one side. She was back at him in a moment. His guards leaped at the girl and grappled with her, but she was able to get in one ripping slash that opened up almost all of his right cheek before they drove her away. "Leave something for the rest of us," one of his guards pleaded, the cause of reason, as he strolled back to Eric. "After all, he belongs to the whole of mankind." "He does not!" she yelled. "He belongs to me most of all. I was going to mate with him when he returned from his theft, wasn't I, Mother?" "There wasn't anything official," Eric heard Rita the record keeper admonishing as he tried to staunch the flow of blood by bringing his shoulder up and pressing it against the wound. There couldn't be anything official about it until he'd achieved manhood. So you'll just have to wait your turn, Harriet, darling. You'll have to wait until your elders are finished with him. There'll be plenty left for you." "There won't be," the girl pouted. "I know what you're like. There won't be hardly anything left." Eric was shoved at the small burrow entrance again. The moment he was inside it, one of his guards planted a foot in his back, knocking the breath out of him. The kick propelled him forward, staggering wildly for balance, until he smashed into the opposite wall. As he fell, unable to use his arms to cushion himself, he heard laughter behind him in the great central burrow. He rolled on his side dizzily. There was a fresh flow of blood coming down from his cheek. This wasn't the homecoming he'd imagined after his theft. Not in the slightest. What was going on? He knew where he was. A tiny blind alley burrow off mankind's major meeting place, a sort of little vault used mostly for storage. Excess food and goods stolen from monster territory were kept here until there was enough accumulated for a trading expedition to the back burrows. Occasionally, also, a male stranger, taken prisoner in battle, might be held in this place until mankind find out if his tribe valued him enough to pay anything substantial for his recovery, and if they didn't... Eric remembered the unusual structure that the women had been building near the royal mound, and shivered. The memory that he'd suppressed had now come alive in his mind, and it fitted with the way Harriet had acted, and with what her mother, Rita, the record keeper, had said. They couldn't be planning that for him. He was a member of mankind, almost a full warrior. They didn't even do that to strangers captured in battle, not normal strangers. A warrior was always respected as a warrior. At the worst, he deserved a decent execution, quietly done, except for... No! He screamed. No! The single guard who'd been left on duty at the entrance turned around and regarded him humorously. "Oh, yes," he said. "Oh, definitely yes. We're going to have a lot of fun with both of you as soon as the women say they're ready." He nodded with ominous, emphatic slowness and turned back to miss none of the preparations. "Both of you?" For the first time, Eric looked around the little storage burrow. The place was almost empty of goods, but off to one side, in the light of his forehead glow lamp, how proud he had been when it had been bestowed on him at the doorway to Monster territory. He now saw another man lying bound against the wall. His uncle. Eric brought his knees up and wriggled rapidly over to him. It was a painful business. His belly and sides were not calloused and inured to the rough burrow floor like his feet. But what did a few scratches more or less matter any more? The trap smasher was barely conscious. He had been severely handled, and he looked almost as bad as his wives. There was a thick crust of dried blood on his hair. The haft of a spear, Eric guessed, had all but cracked his head open, and in several places on his body, his right shoulder, just above his left hip, deep in his thigh, were the oozing craters of serious spear wounds, raw and unbandaged. "Uncle Thomas," Eric urged, "what happened? Who did this to you?" The wounded man opened his eyes and shuddered. He looked around stupidly, as if he had expected to find the walls talking to him. And his powerful arms struggled with the knots that held them firmly behind his back. When he finally located Eric, he smiled. It was a bad thing to do. Someone had almost smashed in most of his front teeth. "Hello, Eric," he mumbled. "What a fight, eh? How did the rest of the band do? Anybody get away?" "I don't know. That's what I'm asking you. I came back from my theft. You were gone. The band was gone. I got here and everybody's crazy. There are strangers out there, walking around with weapons in our burrows. Who are they?" Thomas the Trap Smasher's eyes had slowly darkened. They were fully in focus now, and long threads of agony swam in them. "Strangers?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes. There were strangers fighting in Stephen the Strong-Armed band, fighting against us. That chief of ours, Franklin, he got in touch with strangers after we left. They compared notes. They must have been working together, been in touch with each other for a long time. Mankind, strangers, what difference does it make when their lousy ancestor science is threatened? I should have remembered." "What?" Eric begged. "What should you have remembered?" "That's the way they put down alien science in the other rising, long ago. A chief's a chief. He's got more in common with another chief, even a chief of strangers, than with his own people. You attack ancestor science, and you're attacking their powers, chiefs. They'll work together then. They'll give each other men, weapons, information. They'll do everything they can against the common enemy, against the only people who really want to hit back at the monsters. Oh, I should have remembered. Damn it all. The trap smasher groaned through his ruined mouth. I saw that the chief and O'Teal were suspicious. I should have realized how they were going to handle it. They were going to call in strangers, exchange information, and unite against us. Eric stared at his uncle, dimly understanding. Just as there was a secret organization of alien sciencers that cut across tribal boundaries, so there was a tacit, rarely used understanding among chiefs, based on the ancestor science religion that was the main prop of their power. And the power of the leaders of the female society, come to think of it. All special privileges were derived from their knowledge of ancestor science. Take that away from them and they'd be ordinary women, with no more magical abilities than was necessary to tell edible food from monster poison. Grunting with pain, Thomas the Trap Smasher wormed his way up to a sitting position against the wall. He kept shaking his head as if to jar recollection loose. "They came up to us," he said heavily. "Stephen the Strong-Armed and his band came up to us just after you'd gone into monster territory. A band from Mankind with a message from the chief, who suspected anything. They might be coming to tell us that the home burrows were under attack by strangers. Strangers!" He gave a barking laugh, and some blood splashed out of his mouth. "They had strangers with them, hidden all the way behind in the corridors. Mobs and mobs of strangers." Eric began to visualize what had happened. "Then, when they were among us, when most of us had reslung our spears, they hit us. Eric, they hit us real good. They had us so much by surprise that they didn't even need outside help. I don't think there was much left of us by the time the strangers came running up. I was down, fighting with my bare hands, and so were the rest of the band. The strangers did the mopping up. I didn't see most of it. Somebody handed me one hell of a wallop. I never expected to wake up alive." His voice got even lower and huskier. "I'd have been lucky not to." The Trap Smasher's chest heaved. A strange, long noise came out of it. "They brought me back here. My wives. They were working on my wives. Those bitches from the female society. O'Teal, Rita. This part of it is their business. They had my wives pegged out, and they were working on them in front of me. I was blanking out and coming to, blanking out and coming to. I was conscious while they—" He dropped to a bloody mumble again, his head falling loosely forward. His voice became clear for a moment, but not entirely rational. "They were good women," he muttered. "Both of them. Good girls, and they loved me. They had their chance to become more important. A dozen times Franklin must have offered to impregnate them, and they turned him down every time. They really loved me." Eric almost sobbed himself. He'd had little to do with them once he'd reached the age of the warrior initiate, but in his childhood they'd given him all the mother love he ever remembered. They'd cuffed him and caressed him and wiped his nose. They told him stories and taught him the catechism of the ancestral science. Neither had sons of his age who had survived the various plagues and the monster-inflicted calamities that periodically swept through mankind's burrows. He'd been lucky. He'd received much of the care and affection that their own sons might have enjoyed. Their fidelity to the Trap Smasher had been a constant source of astonishment in Mankind. It had cost them more than the large, healthy litters for which the chief had a well-proved capacity. Such eccentric, such non-womanly behavior had inevitably denied them the high positions in the female society they would otherwise have enjoyed. And now they were dead, or dying, and their surviving babies had been apportioned to other women whose importance would thereby be substantially increased. "Tell me," he asked his uncle, "why did the female society kill them? What did they do that was so awful?" He saw that Thomas had lifted his head again and was staring at him with pity. He felt his own body turn completely cold, even before the Trap Smasher spoke. "You still won't let yourself think about it. I don't blame you, Eric. But it's there. It's being prepared for us outside." "What?" Eric demanded, although a distant part of him had already worked out the terrible answer and knew what it was. "We've been declared outlaws, Eric. They say we're guilty of the ultimate sacrilege against ancestor science. We don't belong to mankind anymore. You, me, my family, my band. We're outside mankind, outside the law, outside religion. And you know what happens to outlaws, Eric, don't you? Anything goes. Anything." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Men in the Walls by William Tenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Ever since early childhood, Eric remembered looking forward to ceremonies of this sort. A stranger would have been caught by one of the warrior bands, and it would be determined that he was an outlaw. 9 times out of 10, such a man was easy enough to identify. No one but an outlaw, for example, would be wandering the burrows by himself, without a band or at least a single companion to guard his back. The 10th time, when there was the slightest doubt, a request for ransom to his people would make the prisoner's position clear. There would be a story of some unforgivable sacrilege, some particularly monstrous crime that could be punished by nothing but complete anathema and the revocation of all privileges as a human being. The man had escaped the punishment being prepared for him. Do with him as you will, his people would say. He is no longer one of us. He is the same as a monster. He is something non-human, so far as we are concerned. Then a sort of holiday would be declared. Out of the bits and pieces of lumber stolen from monster territory and set aside by the women for this purpose, the members of the female society would erect a structure whose specifications had been handed down from mother to daughter for countless generations, all the way back to the ancestors who had built the record machines. It was called a stage or a theater, although Eric had also heard it referred to as the scaffold. In any case, whatever its true name, most of the details concerning it were part of the secret lore of the female society, and as such were no proper concern of males. One thing about it, however, everyone knew. On it would be enacted a moving religious drama, the ultimate triumph of humanity over the wickedness of the monsters. For this, the central character had to fulfill 2 requirements. He had to be an intelligent creature, as the monsters were, so that he could be made to suffer as someday mankind meant the monsters to suffer, and he had to be non-human, as the monsters were, so that every drop of fear, resentment, and hatred distilled by the enormous, swaggering aliens could be poured out upon his flesh without any inhibition of compunction or fellow feeling. For this purpose, outlaws were absolutely ideal, since they all agreed that such disgusting creatures had resigned their membership in the human race. When an outlaw was caught, Work stopped in the burrows, and mankind's warrior bands were called home. It was a great time, a joyous time, a time of festival. Even the children, doing whatever they could to prepare for the glorious event, running errands for the laboring women, fetching refreshment for the stalwart guarding men, even the children boasted to each other how they would express their hatred upon this trapped representative of the non-human, this bound and shrieking protagonist of the utterly alien. Everyone had their chance. All, from the chief himself to the youngest child capable of reciting the catechism of ancestral science, all climbed in their turn upon the stage, or theater, or scaffold that the women had erected. All were thrilled to vent a portion of mankind's vengeance upon the creature who had been declared alien, as an earnest of what they would some day do collectively to the monsters who had stolen their world. Sarah, the sickness healer, had her turn early in the proceedings. Thenceforth she stood on the structure and carefully supervised the ceremony. It was her job to see that nobody went too far, that everyone had a fair and adequate turn, and that even at the end there was some life left in the victim, because then, at the end, the structure had to be completely burned, along with its bloody occupant, as a symbol of how the monsters must eventually be turned into ash and be blown away and vanish. "And mankind will come into its own," she would chant, while the charred fragments were kicked out of the burrow contemptuously. "And the monsters will be gone. They will be gone forever, and there will be nothing upon all the wide earth but mankind." Afterwards there was feasting, there was dancing, there was singing. Men and women chased each other into the dimmer side corridors. Children whooped and yelled around the great central burrow. The few old folks went to sleep with broad, reminiscent smiles upon their faces. Everyone felt they had somehow struck back at the monsters. Everyone felt a little like the lords of creation their ancestors had been. Eric remembered the things he himself had done, the things he had seen others do on these occasions. A tremendous tick of fear rippled through his body. He had to draw his shoulders up to his neck in a tight hunch and tense the muscles of his arms and neck. Finally, his nerves subsided. He could think again, only he didn't want to think. Those others, those outlaws and previous ceremonies of this sort in Auld Lang Syne's long past. Was it possible that they had experienced the same sick, bewildered dread while waiting for the structure to be completed? Had they trembled like this? Had they also felt wetness running down their backs? Had they felt the same pleading squirm in their intestines? The same anticipatory twinges of soft, vulnerable flesh? The thought had never crossed his mind before. He'd seen them as things completely outside humanity, the compressed symbol of all that was alien. One worried about their feelings no more than about those of the roaches scurrying madly about here in the storage burrow. One squashed them slowly or rapidly at one's pleasure. What difference did it make? You didn't sympathize with roaches. You didn't identify with them. But now that he was about to be squashed himself, he realized that it did make a difference. He was human. No matter what mankind and its leaders now declared him to be, he was human. He felt human fears. He experienced a desperate human desire to live. Then so had the others been. The outlaws whom he'd helped tear to pieces. Human. Completely human. They'd sat here just as he did now. They'd sat and waited for the festival and its agonies. Only twice in his memory had members of mankind ever been declared outlaw. Both cases had occurred a long time ago, before he'd even been a warrior initiate. Eric tried now to remember what they had been like as living people. He wanted to reach out and feel companionship, some sort of companionship, even that of the dead. The dead were better than this beaten, bloody man next to him, who had subsided into half-insane mumbles, his battered head on his torn, wound-scribbled chest. What had they been like? It was no use. In the first case, memory brought back only a picture of a screaming hulk just before the fire was lit. No recollection of a man, no fellow human in mankind. And in the second case, Eric sat bolt upright, straining against his bonds. The second man to be declared an outlaw had escaped. How he had done it, Eric had never found out. He remembered only that a guard was severely punished, and that bands of warriors had sniffed for him along far distant corridors for a long time afterward. Escape! That was it! He had to escape! Once declared an outlaw, he would have no hope of mercy, no remission of sentence. The religious overtones of the ceremony being prepared were too highly charged to be halted for anything short of the disappearance of its chief protagonist. Yes, escape. But how? Even if he could get free of the knots which so expertly and so strongly tied his hands behind his back, he had no weapon to hand. The guard at the entrance would transfix him with a spear in a moment. And if he failed, there were others outside, almost the entire warrior strength of the people. How? How? He forced himself to be calm, to go over every possible alternative in his mind. He knew there was not much time. In a little while the structure would be finished and the leaders of the female society would come for him. Eric began working on the knots behind him. He worked without much hope. If he could get his hands loose, perhaps he might squirm his way carefully to the entrance, leap up suddenly and break into a run. So what if they threw a spear through him? Wouldn't that be better and quicker than the other thing? But they wouldn't, he realized. Not unless he were very lucky and some warrior forgot to think straight. In cases like this, when it was a matter of keeping, not killing a prisoner, you aimed for the legs. There were at least a dozen men in mankind with skill great enough to bring him down even at 20 or 25 paces. And another dozen who might be able to catch him. He was no Roy the Runner, after all. Roy. He was dead and skewered by now. He found himself regretting the fight he'd had with Roy. A stranger passed by the storage burrow entrance, glancing in with only a slight curiosity. He was followed in a moment or two by more strangers going the same way. They were leaving, Eric guessed, before the ceremony began. They probably had ceremonies of their own to attend, with their own people. Walter the Weapon Seeker, Arthur the Organizer, were they at this moment sitting in similar storage burrows awaiting the same slow death? Eric doubted it. Somehow he couldn't see these men caught as easily as he and his uncle had been. Arthur was too clever, he was certain of that. And Walter, well, Walter would come up with some fantastic weapon that no one had ever seen or heard of. Like the one he had in his knapsack right now, that red blob the Weapon Seeker had given him. Was it a weapon? He didn't know. But even if it wasn't, he had the impression it could create some kind of surprise. It should make them sit up and notice, Walter had said back in monster territory. Any kind of surprise, any kind of upset, and he might have a diversion under cover of which he and his uncle could escape. But that was the trouble. His uncle. With his hands bound as thoroughly as he could now ascertain they were, he needed his uncle's help to do anything at all, and the trap smasher was obviously too far gone to be at all useful. He was talking to himself in a steady, monotonous, argumentative mutter, his upper body slumping further and further across his own lap. Every once in a while the mutters would be broken by a sharp, almost surprised moan, as his wounds woke into a clearer consciousness of themselves. Most other men in his condition, Eric judged, would have been dead by now. Only a body as powerful as the Trap Smasher's could have lasted this long. And who knew? If they could escape, it was possible that his uncle's wounds, given care and rest, might heal. If they could escape. "Uncle Thomas," he said, leaning toward him and whispering urgently, "I think I know a way out. I think I've figured out a way to escape." No response. The bloody head continued to talk in a low, toneless voice to the lap. Mutter, mutter, mutter. Moan, mutter, mutter. "Your wives," Eric said desperately. "Your wives. Don't you want to get revenge for your wives?" That seemed to be worth a flicker. "My wives," said the thick voice. "They were good women, real good women. They never let Franklin near them. They were real good women." Then the flicker was over and the mutters returned. "Escape!" Eric whispered. "Don't you want to escape?" A thin, coagulating line of blood dripped out of his uncle's slowly working jaws. There was no other answer. Eric looked towards the entrance of the storage burrow. The guard posted there was no longer turning from time to time to glance at the prisoners. The structure outside was evidently nearing completion, and his interest in the final preparations had caused him to take a step or two away from the entrance. He was staring off to the left down the great central burrow in absolute fascination. Well, that was something. It gave them a chance. On the other hand, it also meant that they had scant moments left to their lives. Any time now, the leaders of the female society would be coming to drag them to the torture ceremony. With his eyes on the guard, Eric leaned against the rough burrow wall and began scraping the imprisoning knapsack thongs against the sharpest edges he could find. It wouldn't be fast enough, he realized. If there were only a spear point in this place, something sharp. He looked around feverishly. No, nothing. A few tumbled bags of food, over which lazy roaches wandered. Nothing he could use to help him get free. His uncle was his only hope. Somehow he had to rouse the man, get through to him. He squirmed up close, his mouth against the Trap Smasher's battered ear. "This is Eric. Eric the Only. Do you remember me, Uncle? I went on the theft, Uncle Thomas. I went on the theft with you. 3rd category, remember? I asked for a 3rd category theft, just like you told me to. I did my theft. I was successful. I made it. I did just what you told me to do. I'm Eric the Eye now, right? Tell me, am I Eric the Eye?" Mutters, mumbles, and moans. The man seemed beyond intelligibility. "What about Franklin? He can't do this to us, can he, Uncle Thomas? Don't you want to escape? Don't you want revenge on Franklin, on O'Teal, for what they did to your wives? Don't you? Don't you?" He had to cut through his uncle's confused mist of gathering delirium. In complete desperation, he lowered his head and sank his teeth into a wounded shoulder. Nothing. Just the steady flow of argumentative gibberish, and the thin blood dripping from the mouth. I saw Arthur the Organizer. He said he'd known you for a long time. When did you meet him, Uncle Thomas? When did you first meet Arthur the Organizer?" The head drooped lower. The shoulders slumped further forward. "Tell me about alien science. What is alien science?" Eric was almost gibbering himself now in his frantic efforts to find a key that would unlock his uncle's mind. Are Arthur the Organizer and Walter the Weapon Seeker very important men among the alien sciencers? Are they the chiefs? What was the name of the structure they were hiding in? What is it to the monsters? They talked about other tribes I never heard of. How many other tribes are there? Are these other tribes? That was it. He had found the key. He had gotten through. Thomas the Trap Smasher's head came up waveringly, dimness swirling in his eyes. "Other tribes. Funny that you should ask about other tribes. That you should ask." "Why? What about them?" Eric fought to hold the key in place to keep it turning. "Why shouldn't I ask about those other tribes?" "Your grandmother was from another tribe, a real strange tribe in a far-off burrow. I remember hearing about it when I was a little boy." Thomas the Trap Smasher nodded to himself. "Your grandfather's band went on a long journey, the longest they'd ever taken, and they caught your grandmother and brought her back." "My grandmother?" For a moment Eric forgot what was being prepared for him outside. He'd known there was some peculiar secret about his grandmother. She had rarely been mentioned in Mankind. Up to now he'd taken it for granted that this was because she'd had a son who was terribly unlucky, almost the worst thing a person in the burrows could be. A one-child litter, after all, and being killed together with his wife in monster territory. Very unlucky. My grandmother was from another tribe? Not from Mankind? He knew, of course, that several of the women had been captured from other peoples in neighboring burrows, and had the good fortune now to be considered full-fledged members of Mankind. Sometimes one of their own women would be lost this way when she strayed too far down an outlying burrow and stumbled into a band of stranger warriors. If you stole a woman from another people, after all, you stole a substantial portion of their knowledge. But he'd never imagined— "Dora the Dream Singer." Thomas's head wagged loosely. He dribbled words mixed with red saliva. "Do you know why your grandmother was called the Dream Singer, Eric? The women used to say that the things she talked about happened only in dreams, and that she couldn't talk straight like other people. She could only sing about her dreams. But she taught your father a lot, and he was like her. Women were a little afraid to mate with him. My sister was the first to take a chance, and everyone said she deserved what she got." Abruptly, Eric became conscious of a change in the sounds outside the burrow. More quiet. Were they coming for him now? "Uncle Thomas, listen, I have an idea. Those strangers, Walter, Arthur the Organizer, they gave me a monster souvenir. I don't know what it does, but I can't get at it. I'll turn around. You try to reach down into my knapsack with the tips of your fingers and—" The Trap Smasher paid no attention to him. "She was an alien sciencer," he rambled on, mostly to himself. "Your grandmother was the first alien sciencer we ever had in Mankind. I guess her tribe were all alien sciencers. Imagine a whole tribe of alien sciencers." Eric groaned. This half-alive, delirious man was his only hope of escaping. This bloody wreck who had once been the proudest, most alert band captain of them all. He turned for another look at the guard. The man was still staring down the length of the great central burrow. There was nothing to be heard now but a terrifying silence, as if dozens of pairs of eyes were glowing in anticipation. And footsteps. Were not those footsteps? He had to find a way to make his uncle cooperate. "Thomas, the trap smasher," he said sharply, barely managing to keep his voice low. "Listen to me. This is an order. There's something in my knapsack, a blob of sticky stuff. We're going to turn our backs to each other, and you're going to reach in with your fingers and fish it out. Do you hear me? That's an order, a warrior's order." His uncle nodded, completely docile. "I've been a warrior for over 20 old lang synes," he mumbled, twisting around. "6 of them a band captain. I've given orders and taken them, given them and taken them. I've never disobeyed an order. What I always say is, how can you expect to give orders if you don't—" "Now!" Eric told him, bringing their backs together and hunching down so that his knapsack would be just under his uncle's bound arms. "Reach in. Work that mass of sticky stuff out. It's right on top. And hurry." Yes, those were footsteps coming up outside, several of them. The leaders of the female society, the chief and escort of warriors, and the guard watching that deadly procession was liable to remember his duties and turn back to the prisoners. "Hurry!" he demanded. "I told you to hurry, damn it! That's an order! Get it out fast! Fast!" And all this time, as the trap smasher's fumbling fingers wandered about in his knapsack, as he listened with fright and impatience to the sounds of the approaching execution party, all this time, somewhere in his mind there was wonderment at the orders he was rapping out to an experienced band captain and the incredible authority he had managed to get into his voice. "Now, you're wondering where your grandmother's tribe have their burrow," Thomas began suddenly, reverting to an earlier topic, as if they were having a pleasant conversation after a fine full meal. "Forget it! Get that stuff out! Just get it out!" "It's hard to describe," the other man's voice wandered on. "A long way off their burrow is, a long way off. You know the strangers call us front burrow people. You know that, don't you? The strangers are back burrowers. Well, your grandmother's people are the bottom-most burrowers of all." Eric sensed his fingers closing in the knapsack. The 3 women who ruled the female society came into the storage burrow. Ottilie the omen teller, Sarah the sickness healer, and Rita the record keeper. With them was the chief and 2 band captains, heavily armed. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Men in the Walls by William Tenn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Ottilie, the chieftain's first wife, was in the lead. She stopped just inside the entrance to the burrow, and the others came to a halt around her. "Look at them," she jeered. "They're trying to free each other. And what do they plan to do if they get themselves untied?" Franklin moved to her side and took a long, judicious look at the 2 men squatting back to back. "They'll try to escape," he explained, continuing his wife's joke. "They'll have their hands free, they figure, and surely Thomas the Trap Smasher and his nephew are a match, even barehanded, for the best spearmen in mankind." And then Eric felt the searching hands come up out of the knapsack to which his own arms were tied. Something fell to the floor of the burrow. It made an odd noise, halfway between a splash and a thud. He twisted around for it immediately with his mouth open, flexing his knees in a tight crouch underneath his body. "You've never seen anything like the burrows of your grandmother's people," his uncle was mumbling, as if what his hands had just done was of no concern to the rest of him. "And neither have I, though I've listened to the tales." "He won't last long now," Sarah the sickness healer commented. "We'll have to have our fun with the boy." "All you do," Walter the weapon seeker had said, "is tear off a pinch with your fingers, then spit on it and throw it. Throw it as fast and as far as you can." He couldn't use his fingers, but he leaned down to the red blob and nipped off a piece with his teeth. He brought his tongue against the strange, soft substance, lashing saliva into it, and simultaneously he kicked at the burrow floor with curved toes, straightening his legs, jerking his thighs and body upward. Unable to use his arms for balance, he tottered erect and turned, swaying to face the leaders of his people. "After you spit on it, throw it fast and as far as you can." "I don't know what he's doing," someone said, "but I don't like it. Let me through." Stephen the strong-armed stepped ahead of the group and lifted a heavy spear ready for throwing. Eric shut his eyes, bent his head far back on his neck, and took a deep, deep breath. Then he snapped his head forward, flipping his tongue hard against the object in his mouth. He forced